Let's take that. Thank you very much. Jeff, thank you for that very kind introduction. Once again, my introducers made me feel like Henry Kissinger, a legend in his own mind. The media, which has been my profession for almost 41 years, has frequently been accused of being lazy and apathetic and ignorant and biased and anti-defense and anti-CIA, anti-national security, and ideologically motivated on the left. I'm usually a little more critical. La Fontaine, the French poet, said that every editor pays tribute to the devil. I personally happen to feel that that tribute had become a little excessive, and that is why I return to the rigors of daily and weekly journalism, as I'm also the editor-in-chief of Insight magazine. As the resident journalist scholar at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, between the time I left Newsweek in 1980 and when I joined the Washington Times almost 2 years ago, I studied the U.S. media. We have about 1,750 daily newspapers in this country, 4,000 TV stations, 10,000 radio stations. And I was just astonished at the Johnny one-note quality of our media compared to, say, Western democratic societies on the other side of the Atlantic. Even tiny Luxembourg, a country of 300,000 inhabitants, has a strong, muscular media voice on the left, one on the right, and one in the center, which is the way it should be in a multi-party democracy. We have a two-party democracy and basically a one-party press. And I'm glad to see that the National Journal, not to be confused with Bill Buckley's National Review, the National Journal, in its most recent issue, says that the Washington Times has finally arrived as a credible national alternative voice. The media today, unfortunately, are no longer spectators in national and international politics. They've become players. Deplorable, regrettable, but nevertheless an irrefutable fact of national and international life. What the media say and how they say it has a very important bearing in shaping perceptions on Capitol Hill and on the conduct of foreign policy. 2 months ago, as you may remember, the debate in this country seemed to be whether President Reagan belonged on Mount Rushmore. Today, we're being asked to contemplate the failure of his entire presidency. Preposterous, but true. I was astonished the night before last at the office when the first edition of the Washington Post came in with a banner headline story by Bob Woodward which said CIA aiding Iraq in Gulf War. The subhead read, target data from US satellites supplied for nearly 2 years. And that was a major exclusive story. Well, I remembered the story in our own paper a few months ago, so I asked my secretary the next morning to dig it up. And sure enough, we published that story on September 5th. And we wrote about it again on December 8th. And here it was in the Post on Monday as a banner headline story with a suitably pungent deck and written no less by none other than this veteran Pulitzer Prize winner, Bob Woodward. And you wonder why Woodward's editors would buy a regurgitated story attributed to the usual informed sources and repackage it as headline news. And this had knowledgeable folks in Washington yesterday scratching their heads. And I decided to write an editorial about this, which appeared this morning. And the conclusion of the editorial is that the Reagan administration has been seriously wounded by the Iran-Contra caper, and the Post smells blood in the water. Anything that keeps the sharks in a feeding frenzy, even if it's old news, is the name of the game now. It makes good political sense if you're gunning for a president, but it's lousy journalism. Do you think I'm exaggerating? I'm not exaggerating one bit. My old friend Ben Bradley, and I must confess that I did hire him in 1954 to succeed me as Paris bureau chief for Newsweek before returning to New York. Ben Bradley was quoted last week as saying he's never had more fun since Watergate. Well, I've never been more miserable, personally, since Watergate. Last night's evening news programs, some of you may have seen, ABC, CBS, NBC, all roughly the same, parading one politician after another saying that the diversion of Iran arms sales profits to political action committees to support pro-Contra candidates in this country is the most outrageous thing they've heard in their entire political careers, all based on one report in the Lowell Sun. And the New York Times, which led with this story yesterday morning, actually led with a story that appeared in the Lowell Sun, and in the third paragraph, they conceded that the vast resources of the New York Times had not managed to confirm any part of the story. It's almost an accepted fact today, something that has not yet been proved. And that is the way we seem to be operating. As Saul Bellow once said, a great deal of intelligence can be invested in ignorance when the need for illusion is deep. And the illusion that the media never tire of conjuring up is that the world is simply a stage for a morality melodrama with the United States invariably cast as the villain on the wrong side of history. Is that an exaggeration? Well, not according to Ted Turner, who's running perhaps the world's only global television network today and sings Castro's praises and explained recently that, like Jesus, I have made my peace with the Soviets. They're not my enemies and they want real peace. His mission, he says now, is to create a global village of US-Soviet understanding. Once the American and Soviet people truly know each other, Turner says they will be friends and nobody wants to hurt their friend. He thinks the arms race can be stopped by TV shows supporting his thesis, and that the solution to the arms race is simply to stop it, while the solution to the nuclear arms race is simply to get rid of them. And in another recent rambling address, this electronic media tycoon endorsed Mario Cuomo for president, and then explained that it was a terrible realization for him to come to, because no one loves America more than Ted. But after studying the problem, presumably after 3 trips to Moscow, he had reluctantly come to the conclusion that the US was the greatest threat in the world. This is the head of one of our major television networks. So don't tell me that this doesn't go on. Bismarck once said that history is quite simply a piece of paper covered with print. The main thing is still to make history, not to write it. There is nothing inevitable about history as the Soviets would have us believe. History is neutral, to be shaped by political and military leaders, not by media stars and public opinion pollsters, which is increasingly our way of government. But whether an American president can still make history in this day and age is highly debatable. The War Powers Act of 1973, like the Neutrality Act of the 1930s, has seriously undermined America's role as the world's principal countervailing power. We have had 4 watershed congressional amendments since 1975 that have increasingly paralyzed the executive in the exercise of its principal responsibility, national and international security. Most people have forgotten the Cambodian Amendment in 1975, which withdrew any kind of assistance to our Cambodian allies from one day to the next, collapsing the Cambodian government, allowing the Khmer Rouge to take over, which in turn triggered the unraveling of the situation in South Vietnam much earlier than even North Vietnamese generals had anticipated. And even General Giap, the famous North Vietnamese commander, wrote in his memoirs that they had to improvise an offensive and drive to Saigon as quickly as possible because they thought Saigon was still at least 2 or 3 years down the road. That was done as the direct result of a congressional amendment. Later that year, we had the Tunney Amendment in Angola, which was almost entirely manipulated by the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, if the true history of that amendment is ever written. And what happened? UNITA forces were 18 miles south of Luanda. The operation, which was a covert CIA operation, was stopped from one day to the next, allowing the MPLA communist government to take over with their Cuban allies. The following year, we had the Clark Amendment in 1976, which prevented any kind of assistance to anti-communist forces under Jonas Savimbi, any kind of assistance from the United States for 10 years until last year, when the Clark Amendment was finally repealed. And then we had the Boland Amendment, which is, of course, very much in the news these days. these days, which cut off anti-communist forces in Nicaragua from receiving even a single bullet from the United States, not even giving them enough to bleed to death with dignity. These were the congressional amendments, and they were not the will of the American people, because the American people don't even know the history of these amendments. Not even one congressman out of 100 today knows what the Tunney Amendment is. There is no sense of history, no realization of what the legislative branch has been doing to the executive branch. So what was President Reagan supposed to do when he took over? To try to reverse the Brezhnev doctrine. He did indeed perceive that he had a historic opportunity to try to reverse the Brezhnev doctrine. And that led to the Reagan Doctrine, which was enunciated in London in June of '82, as you well know, before a session of both houses of the British Parliament. And it consisted of fostering and promoting the infrastructure of democracy all over the world and helping anti-communist guerrilla forces fighting in Nicaragua, in Angola, and in Afghanistan. I think the problem we're trying to grapple with today, if I understand the subject at hand, the problem we're trying to grapple with is quite simply called news and the dominant culture, which incidentally is the title of a brilliant little monograph by John Corey, the TV critic of the New York Times, which was put out by the Media Institute in Washington 4 months ago. The dominant media culture, which John Corey says poses as the center but is actually on the left, excoriates anyone who does not conform to the mindset as right-wing. It is the no enemies on the left syndrome, and it is the climate within which then very successful Soviet disinformation operations seem to thrive. And when The Spike, my book on Soviet disinformation, came out in 1980, it was dismissed almost unanimously by my profession as garbage. And now, as you know, no one challenges the fact that there are very important disinformation operations that take place in the Western media. Reporters and commentators constantly refer to the right wing and to right-wing thinking, but you never see anything about left-wing thinking. Thus, the message is that the left wing simply does not exist and is a function of irrational fears on the right, and that it is more fiction than fact. Thus, too, people like Congressman Dellums and Conyers are identified as Democrats, while Jesse Helms is, by the same token, right-wing or ultra-conservative. I heard someone on TV last night being described as a rabid anti-communist. I've never heard anyone described as a rabid pro-communist. Jean-François Revel, who was editor-in-chief of France's most important magazine, L'Express, throughout the 1970s, and then wrote more recently that bestseller, How Democracies Perish, which was quoted by Jeane Kirkpatrick in her famous convention speech in Dallas in 1984, Revel says that Western democratic civilization is the first in history to blame itself because another power and its proxies are working to destroy it. Not only do democracies today award themselves sins that they have never committed, but as Revel explains, they have formed the very nasty habit of judging themselves as defendants who are automatically guilty and of deliberately adopting policies that are favorable to their enemies. It is the dominant media culture which leads to a reluctance which at times appears to border on the paraplegic, to face certain unpalatable or unfashionable facts. And I'll give you some examples. Revolutions in the Third World, for example, that are described over and over again as spontaneous phenomena. On the rare occasions when they are spontaneous phenomena, they are then quickly hijacked by a tiny minority of Marxists who then proceed to impose a more draconian form of dictatorship than the one they have overthrown, while conducting massive disinformation operations in this country to pretend, while they are consolidating their hold over this revolution to pretend that they stand for democratic, pluralistic principles. We saw this with the National Liberation Front in South Vietnam, with Castro when he was up in the mountains being written about by Herbert Matthews in the New York Times, and we saw it again with the Sandinistas in 78 and 79. This reluctance leads to a very pernicious thing called censorship by omission. Stories of jugular concern that are spiked or relegated to the back sections of a newspaper because they might change perceptions in a way that the dominant culture disapproves of. And don't take my word for it, some very distinguished journalists have written about this phenomenon, including John Corey in his little monograph. Shirley Christian, now with the New York Times, who won a Pulitzer Prize for international reporting for the Miami Herald back in 1981, wrote a devastating piece for the Washington Journalism Review in March of '82. And she explained how the media had misreported the Sandinista revolution against Somoza. She noted, for example, that Thomas Borghe, the revolution's strongman before the Ortegas surfaced, who is now incidentally Minister of the Interior in charge of the secret police, which is headed by a fellow named Lenin Serda. Lenin, as we all know, is a good Christian name. Borghe was Castro's oldest friend in Nicaragua and Gaddafi's latest and newest friend, a man who had achieved almost mythical stature in Latin American politics or revolutionary politics, was barely mentioned in the coverage of that revolution by our own media. And incidentally, our media went on discussing whether or not that regime was really a Marxist-Leninist regime until quite recently. And yet on the very first day of that revolution, 196 Cuban officers, including 3 generals and 16 colonels, marched into the Interior Ministry the day Somoza was overthrown to organize the secret police. On February 10th of 1982, the Wall Street Journal devoted an extraordinary 1,500-word editorial to the brazen disinformation campaign going on in our media at that time over El Salvador, even citing by name, which I had never seen done before, because I've carefully refrained from doing that when I was writing about disinformation back in the late 70s and early 80s, but this one even cited by name reporters from the New York Times and the Washington Post. Dr. Robert S. Lakin, who edited the so-called Democratic alternative to the bipartisan Kissinger Commission report on Central America in January of '84, and who was a fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and a self-avowed admirer and supporter of the Sandinistas, suddenly, after 6 trips to Nicaragua, wrote a watershed piece for the New Republic, October of '84, in which he said he had been totally disinformed by the Sandinistas as to what was happening in that country. This piece was fascinating because he said that disaffected Nicaraguan intellectuals who poured their hearts out to him in private said they were actually afraid to meet with American reporters based in Managua because they knew that these people sympathized with the Sandinistas. It is the dominant media culture that tends to portray our enemies as misunderstood innocents and our own leaders as the foes of democracy and freedom. It is this dominant culture that will reflexively praise such works as Endless Enemies by Jonathan Whitney of the Wall Street Journal, probably one of the most poisonous anti-American books it has been my misfortune to read in the last 25 years, or would praise another book by T.D. Allman called Unmanifest Destiny. Well, it so happens that T.D. Allman and Jonathan Whitney, both of these gentlemen are radicals, not mainstream liberals. The news twisters, and they've been written about over and over again by members of my own profession, have thrived very successfully, at least through the 40 years that I've spent in the business. And now we have the author of Reckless Disregard, Renata Adler, a lady with impeccable liberal credentials who has exposed the dubious practices of such giants as CBS and Time magazine in the Westmoreland and Sharon libel cases. These 2 giants pulled out all the stops to silence Miss Adler and thwart publication with an injunction. Mercifully, Miss Adler triumphed, But of course, it now remains to be seen whether the book is going to be appropriately displayed in the bookstores, because I ran into this problem with both The Spike and Monimbo. Even though both were on the New York Times bestseller list, invariably you were told that it could be found at the back of the store. This happened to me in Cleveland, among other places. As long as we go on refusing to admit that there is something called the dominant liberal culture in the media, I think we are very much like Niccolo Machiavelli on his deathbed, and his father confessor was begging him to recant, and he said, "Niccolo, this is your big chance, repudiate the devil." And Niccolo leaned forward and with his last breath said, "Please, Father, this is no time to be making enemies." So, I don't know how many more minutes I have, but I was told 30 and then we get into questions. I think I have 5 more minutes. No amount of liberal outrage can alter or attenuate or evade the harsh geopolitical realities that our self-avowed enemies consider themselves to be in a permanent state of war with Western democracies, albeit indirect warfare conducted through a variety of proxies. And international terrorism is an integral part of this strategy. There is a well-coordinated, carefully orchestrated, and deceptively concealed strategy among like-minded radical states, all of them with close links, covert or overt, to the Soviet Union. But when poor Claire Sterling, who had spent 4 years researching this subject, came out with her book, The Terror Network, in 1980, and bear in mind that she's a lady with impeccable liberal credentials. She was a member of the Communist Youth League at NYU in her youth. When her book came out, she was excoriated by her liberal colleagues for mindless anti-communism. And her book was dismissed as nonsense by people who knew nothing about the subject. She'd spent 4 years traveling all over the world and researching it. The sum total of all the knowledge accumulated throughout recorded history, going back about 5,000 years, is now doubling every 10 years. Yet extraordinarily few people seem to understand the mechanics of low-intensity, low-risk, high-payoff warfare, where peace is not kept by love and unilateral gestures of restraint, but by a combination of fear and respect. Thank you very much.